Hi there, Lit Crit peeps, and welcome back. Today I will be talking about American Lit, 1945 to the present. We're in Volume E. We've got a finish line in front of us. And I'll also talk about John Cheever, whose story, The Swimmer, we read for Saturday. But before I go through those two items, I'd like to front load you with the discussion topics that will be happening for week 12. First one is about John Cheever's The Swimmer, and it fits very well into postmodern fiction, especially the short story form, in that it's talking about what America is like post World War II. And it's talking about upper middle class suburbs, and basically the notion of the suburb, which is really a construction and an artifact of World War II and post World War II American prosperity. It changes the way land is used. It changes the way that people are organized. It changes the faces of cities. It changes the role of automobiles in American culture. We all live in SoCal, and we know this already to a great extent, in that we live in our cars for a lot of the time. And it wasn't always that way. But there are certain things that happened in the US that made that happen. We'll also be writing on Flannery O'Connor's short story, Good Country People. And she is one of these Southern fiction writers, but she's taking place after World War II. That puts her into the postmodern fiction movement. And we'll talk a little bit about postmodernism today and how it's different from modernism. So stay tuned for that. But Flannery O'Connor and her stories often get put into postmodern Southern fiction as a category, but you could certainly also call them Southern Gothic. She resisted that term. Part of that's because she was just fiercely stubborn and didn't always agree with how non-Southerners looked at Southern fiction. But the thing is, there are some things going on in her stories that are just a bit off the beaten path. And stay tuned for that. It's a story that brings up interesting reactions in people. But let's talk about American Lit, 1945 to this morning. Well, World War II is the defining global event of the middle part of the century. And afterwards, Europe is still in shambles, both physically, structurally, but also economically. And the US, on the other hand, comes out as a global superpower, kind of taking over where Europe and England left off. Russia, in the form of the Soviet Union, is also moving forward into a global superpower role as well. As you know, Russia and its forces, under the guise of the Soviet Union, do expand into Eastern Europe, and the Soviet powers tend to grow geographically that way, including in Eastern Germany and lots of other places. But of course, there's a great cost to all of this, and part of that is the development of nuclear technology and nuclear weapons. I'm feeling really mixed about how I built this slide, but in some ways it kind of, I think, fits in that there is something about atomic power that blasts through previously thought cognitive and social and scientific and political boundaries. It's a game changer around the world. And for those of you who grew up after the collapse of the Soviet Union and after that particular Cold War died, it's a very different world. But I'll talk a little bit about that in my insights as a child growing up in the 80s. And of course, changing the tone a little bit here, the atomic bomb did help to end World War II quickly and decisively and saved a lot of American lives, but at great cost to people in Japan, especially in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If you ever want to see a film that will rip your heart out, um, Studio Ghibli has a film. It's called The Graveyard of Butterflies. And Studio Ghibli does all these wonderful films. You know, they did My Neighbor Totoro, Porco Rosso, Ponyo, um, Spirited Away. But this one is very, very serious, and it's so real it will just gut you. But it's an incredibly eloquent homage and elegy to those who had to deal with the aftermath of a nuclear attack. And one of the things we do need to know about American culture is that fear of nuclear war, I'm just going to say paranoia, grips the nation, and it becomes a very powerful political weapon to scare people into doing things that they wouldn't do otherwise and to condemning people that thought differently from them. Not everybody had a bomb shelter. That tends to be the exception rather than the rule. I know for those of you who are Fallout fans, you might think everybody had one, but that's not true. But the Red Scare was also a very important development in post-World War II America. The Anti-American Activities Committee, spearheaded by Senator Joseph McCarthy, destroyed people's lives through unconstitutional activities of interrogation and intimidation. Just being the member of a political party or sympathizing with people all over the world, not having committed a single act of anything was enough to get you thrown in jail. And Senator McCarthy blatantly lied to the American people, refused to show evidence or to show people exactly what they were being accused of. So it was a real dark fascistic moment in American history. And it was the fear of Soviet aggression, it was the fear of nuclear war, it was the fear of Soviet espionage that helped make these horrific breaches of democracy and of law possible. It's a real heartbreaking point in American history, and especially for American civil rights. Thousands of people's lives were ruined, including, people that tend to, be on the left side of the political spectrum. I'm talking educators, artists, civil rights workers, activists. And this is how it basically would go. He would hold up an envelope and say, I have information. Oh shoot, I don't have that. I don't know, I thought I had a good cartoon of that. I have information about you being a member of the Communist Party. Not that you committed any crime, just that you were a member of the party. Just membership in something was enough to ruin your career. Or that he would have other information, but he would say, we will not prosecute you if you rat out everybody else. So it had this kind of chilling effect throughout these sectors of artists, educators, activists. And here's the other thing. We will be looking at Tennessee Williams' play later on, A Streetcar Named Desire, made into a fantastic mid-century movie starring Marlon Brando, directed by Elia Kazan. He was one of the people that ratted out his friends. He named names in order to keep his career. So it's really sullied his reputation in a lot of ways. It was a brutal time. People turned on each other. Really, really tough stuff. Okay, let's move on. Come on, click. The other more domestic end of post-war life in America is this rise in consumerism. And as much as you may dig the graphics, and let's face it, there's some really great atomic age graphic design going on in this period. The idea that ramping up spending was the way to a happy life is something that really takes hold. Kind of reminds me of early WandaVision episodes, right? Oh man, there's that picture. I need to redo this order, but I'm not going to start over. I'm just not. I'm on a roll. I have here in my hand, and there's just basically Joseph McCarthy and his fraudulent evidence. He ended up in disgrace as a political leader, and his reputation is forever denigrated and tarnished due to the violation of civil rights and due process that he effected while being the chair of the Anti-American Activities Committee. And there's Suburbia coming back. Oh, I really need to redo these. But again, the whole idea of post-war prosperity is really, really important to what we're looking at. And we'll definitely see this in John Cheever's story, The Swimmer. America's economy is just roaring back. And all of that wartime economy is shifting into technology economy, production economy, including all kinds of important goods, including the automobile market, which goes to great lengths, along with the tire and rubber industries, to dismantle public transportation in certain sectors of the U.S. in order to make people buy more cars. This happens in Los Angeles, especially. We used to have a light rail system that went all the way to the ocean in the west, all the way to San Bernardino in the east, all the way to San Diego in the south, and all the way to Ventura in the north. It got bought up by automobile and tire concerns so that people would buy more cars. So if you want to know why you're always stuck in traffic, there's one of the reasons. And yes, this is totally related to the plot of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. But even if you look at aesthetic elements here, what you will notice in cars from the time is that a lot of their design and their line work is derived from the airplane design during World War II. So there's a certain streamlined and rounded edge and even like tail fins that resemble those of military planes. So even though it's a post-war culture, there's a certain wartime aesthetic or military aesthetic that's being adopted to parts of the economy that are not military. That's why so many cars in the 50s just look so amazing, so sweet. Some even have rockets and planes here as their head dressings. The other part of suburbia, which is a flight from the challenges of the city in some ways, is this increased idea of segregation. African Americans and minorities were instrumental in winning World War II, in fighting among and next to white Americans, but there was still this ferocious sense of segregation. And those of you who know about redlining, that took place all over the U.S. and including in California and L.A., know this legacy continued well into the 60s, late 60s, maybe even early 70s. But also we see a continued interest in women's rights as part of the early civil rights movement. A lot of women entered the workforce during World War II and realized they could be financially independent and could do things outside of being a homemaker. I mean, being a homemaker is one choice, but some women decided that that was not what they wanted to do. So women entering the workforce helps to keep the idea of women's equal rights and feminism rising and moving fast in the United States. And that brings me to the end of this video. Part 2 will be coming up next. I will see you then.